In the year 1997, the West got a big taste for JRPGs with the release of Final Fantasy VII for the Sony PlayStation. Often regarded as one of the finest games of its genres of all time, it was the first Final Fantasy game to be a bestseller in the United States. While the iron was hot, Square, now Square Enix, released the next game in the series in 1999, nearly 2 years after its predecessor's release. This video goes through the story of Final Fantasy VIII from development to its release to take a look at the game that rode on the momentum of one of the most critically acclaimed and commercially successful RPGs of all time. During the development of Final Fantasy VII, Square had already started working on the next main game in the Final Fantasy series. This new game, aptly named Final Fantasy VIII, was given the challenge of being one of the most visually realistic games in the franchise to date while not straying too far away from its fantasy roots. Game director Yoshinori Kitase decided this very early in the game's conception. More time was to be spent on character models and the surrounding environments to achieve this realism. Particular attention was paid to making the characters look humanly proportionate, moving away from the retro 2D or blocky styles that had been used in previous games. This ended up setting the scene for all main games of the series moving forward. Both characters and environments were given a more friendly and less dark design, again moving away from previous games. Art director Yusuke Naura mentioned in an interview with Famitsu magazine in 1998 that the game was to be a bright, fresh Final Fantasy, a large jump away from the dark and heavy setting of its predecessor. This was welcomed by designers, as most of them had been working on Final Fantasy VII and accepted that a change of pace was a good idea. Eager to start on the game with a much warmer aesthetic, this steered members of the team to think about their own lighter and happier times in their lives for inspiration. Subsequently, this set up the story and the theme of the game from early in development, a tale of kids in school. As the game became more and more serious throughout the character's journey, eventually at the end it was planned to finish back on this note of kids just being kids and doing the kind of things that teenagers would do. Another difference was planned for Final Fantasy VIII. It was decided that the game was to have more of a sci-fi setting compared to the rest of the games of the series, with some of the themes being space and time travel. During an interview concerning Final Fantasy VIII Remastered, Kitase said, "While visually it presents as near-future sci-fi, I wanted the base of the story and the world to be centered in fantasy, so I included sorceresses." Later into the interview, Kitase went on to talk about how fairy tales also influenced the game's setting, elaborating about the two sorceresses that are part of the game's story, a good sorceress in the west and an evil sorceress in the east, similar to the story from Wizard of Oz. Kitase also mentioned in an interview with Game Informer that a number of people were saying, "Isn't it time for something new? We'd like a new system," relating to the series' previous formula of battle. Get money and items, get experience, level up, rinse and repeat. With this in mind, development of the game's battle system shifted away from the old way and into something a Final Fantasy game had never really tried before. Enter the junctioning system. A mechanic where characters were equipped with Guardian Forces, this game's name for summons, and known commonly as GFs for short. Magic is then collected from monsters or by refining items, then equipped onto the slots onto the GF. This enhanced character stats and allowed for more control over defense and attack elements, allowing players to have more control and put more strategic thought into how they built their parties. Characters would still level up with experience as usual like previous games, but to get the most out of battles, the player would need to understand and master this new junctioning system, as without it, characters were basically all the same. Stats and the return of limit breaks were the only things that differentiated characters from each other. Character abilities were unique to the GFs themselves. If a character had a GF equipped, they could then use these abilities. The abilities were learned by GFs similar to a character gaining experience after battle, and they could be equipped to any character. This allowed abilities and special moves to be easily transferred to other members of the team. This system also took over from equipping a character with armour. Normally in a Final Fantasy game, equipping armour would increase a character's stats and resistances. In Final Fantasy VIII, this was left up to the Guardian Forces, and also the junctioning system. Changeable weapons did make a comeback, with each character being a specialist of their own weapon type. There was not really any interchangeability between the characters themselves. But weapons were no longer as important as they were in the old games, only really increasing attack stats and in some cases changing a character's limit break. These could also only be crafted in a weapon shop in towns, using rare items rather than, say, from monster drops or found in chests. This was definitely something new for the Final Fantasy series. Music was to be created by Nobuo Uematsu, a composer who was more than familiar with creating powerful and emotional music for JRPG games. Uematsu had worked on many of the franchise's previous titles, even going as far back as the original Final Fantasy game on the Nintendo Famicom. Much like other aspects of Final Fantasy VIII during creation, it was decided the game would have a completely different feel in terms of its story. Previous games had characters that were of varying ages and had completely different backgrounds, whereas Final Fantasy VIII put more emphasis on the bonds of the main characters. This tied them a lot closer together in terms of their past experiences. Tying back into the thought of kids at school and even more so into the theme of realism, character director and battle visual director Tetsuya Nomura suggested that the game have a school days feel. This would have all of the protagonists be young and around the same age to add more realism to the game's universe. This ended up translating to the Garden Organisation, a group of academies that train up a military force of students in combat. The environments created for the gardens were inspired by real visits to school around Japan by the design team. This was to get the correct feel for school life and to convey this in the game's world. At the heart of Final Fantasy VIII, there is a love story, something that was experimented with slightly in previous games but never to this kind of scale or with this amount of feeling for the characters' bonds. The characters who fall in love, Squall and Rinoa, gradually become smitten with each other over the course of the game. This starts with a not interested feeling by Squall, but after many experiences him and Rinoa start to warm up to each other. This again ties back to the fairy tale feel that was set for the game. In fact, more and more ties can be found in the game's story that relate to fairy tales. Talks of knights, a damsel in distress saved by a hero, albeit in space, and even the final parts of the game placed in a large medieval style castle, which is a complete swap from the game's sci-fi theme. Releasing throughout the year 1999 for the PlayStation, the game became a bestseller in Japan, North America and the United Kingdom. The whole game span across 4 discs, one more than the previous game. Fans of Final Fantasy were itching to get their hands onto the next game and dive into the new experience, so much so that it became the fastest selling game in the franchise at the time, selling 2.5 million copies in its first 4 days in Japan alone. According to Square Enix, Final Fantasy VIII has now sold 9.6 million copies to date since its release, making it one of Square's highest selling games in the Final Fantasy franchise. The bar for Square was set quite high. Final Fantasy VII was already a critically acclaimed success and fans were expecting the same level of quality or better from the developer. Fans of Final Fantasy, many of whom that were introduced into the series with the 7th game, didn't realise the next game would be completely its own, and they instead expected a sequel. In some areas, the game fell short of its fans' expectations. Many people were put off by the lack of voice acting, something that was present in many games at the time. This didn't come to the main games in the series till Final Fantasy X on the PS2. Others disagreed with the game's core mechanics. Mechanics that had been well cemented into the series for years were replaced with the new and somewhat controversial junction system that was mentioned before. Some players just found this system boring or tedious. Others found that they could become overpowered by just not levelling up, as this stopped the monsters from also levelling up, and just refining items to get the max amount of magic and equipping it to ramp up their stats. It was a bold move by Square to mix up the proven formula of Final Fantasy games, a case of too many experiments too fast that definitely left large groups of fans disappointed. But that's not to say that people thought Final Fantasy VIII was completely bad. Players raved about its great looking motion camera cutscenes, some of which are still memorable to this day, such as the landing on Dollar and the assassination attempt on Adir in Delling City. Much like with the cutscenes, players loved the flashing, exciting scenes that played out when a Guardian force was called into battle, with the graphics being completely mind-blowing at the time of release. Even some of the all-time fan favourites showed up from previous games, such as Shiva and Bahamut. In conclusion, Final Fantasy VIII was the game where Square tried one too many experiments at once on a well-established franchise. Good ideas that just got tangled up with each other and would have been better left for another day, or that should have been gently introduced to ease the fans into over the course of the series. Even though the game sold well on release for the PlayStation and then eventually on the PC, it was still considered to be the black sheep of the Final Fantasy family. Just a bit too weird to hang out with the cool games, but not bad enough that it can hang with the bad games either. Often overlooked by the fans of the series, this has been reflected by the attention the game received after release. While Final Fantasy VII was getting movies and spin-off games, other main series were being released, and Final Fantasy VIII really only got a hand in the Dissidia series for PSP and later on the PS4. This left die-hard fans of the game to simply think Square Enix just completely forgot about Final Fantasy VIII. As time went by, more and more Final Fantasy games from the PlayStation 1 and 2 eras were getting ports and remasters, while there was no sign of Squall and friends ever making a return. For over 20 years, fans of the game were made to wait before Square Enix even re-acknowledged the existence of Final Fantasy VIII, and announcing that it was to get a remastered edition for this generation. Much speculation has surrounded why there was such a delay with the game making a comeback. Some believed it was due to its forgettability, others believing that it was because Square Enix secretly wanted to put the black sheep behind them. But potentially this is down to a number of reasons, none of which are really based on the game's popularity, but the biggest reason could be the fault of Square Enix themselves. They never expected that older titles would ever be ported to newer game consoles. So many older games have just had their source code lost to time, making it hard for Square Enix to revisit the games and make improvements for a remaster. It's fair to say that with the change of scenery and presentation, that as a standalone game, Final Fantasy VIII would have been a great one. Again, that's not to say that the 8th game is a bad game, it's just not what people expected from Square. A lot of things that made a Final Fantasy game feel like a Final Fantasy game were lost. No more goblins, no more characters that were more fantasy than reality, and no more leveling of magic or character jobs that fans were used to. How do you feel about Final Fantasy VIII? Is this a game that deserves to be alongside some of the other games from the Legendary series, or do you prefer that it's just one of them games that just doesn't get talked about? Let us know in the comments below. This has been John from Pixelpendium.